Hello, my name is Alan Cohn. I'm Assistant Secretary for Strategy Planning, Analysis, and Risk at the United States Department of Homeland Security. I want to welcome everyone to World Risk Day and to this panel presentation. Today, what I wanted to do was give you an introduction to Homeland Security in the United States, to DHS, and to our office, the DHS Office of Strategy Planning, Analysis, and Risk, and talk a bit about how we use strategic planning, risk modeling, analysis, and assessment to inform Homeland Security policy and strategy. We'll leave some time for discussion and questions at the end. So first, an introduction to U.S. Homeland Security. In 2010, the Department of Homeland Security released its first Quadrennial Homeland Security Review. In that review, we laid out a vision for Homeland Security, and that is a homeland that's safe, secure, and resilient, where American interests, aspirations, and way of life can thrive. And as part of that vision, we laid out a set of 5 Homeland Security missions: preventing terrorism and enhancing security, securing and managing our borders, enforcing and administering our immigration laws, safeguarding and securing cyberspace, and ensuring resilience to disasters. We also made the statement that ultimately Homeland Security is about effectively managing risks to the nation's security. And what this means is that risk, examined at the macro level, is a lens through which we make sense of a complex and in many ways uncertain strategic environment. Now, this point that Homeland Security concerns risk management is an important point, and it's one that's been made by every one of our 3 secretaries to date. And this is especially important because the idea of risk management carries with it the element of uncertainty in 2 respects. First, some risks will materialize despite our best efforts to prevent them. Second, some risks for which we prepare, even those that seem most compelling, will not materialize. So Homeland Security requires addressing some small risks so they don't materialize into big risks, being prepared for risks that don't end up occurring, or else we risk being surprised by less frequent but overwhelming events, and building in resilience to those events that cannot be precluded. Now also, since all decisions in public management are made through the interplay of operational, technical, and political perspectives, macro-level risk modeling, assessment, and analysis provides a way to inform the perspectives of political and operational leadership and drive to decisions about strategic priorities, areas of emphasis and de-emphasize for programming and budgeting, and guidance for major investment oversight. So for strategic decisions, macro-level risk analysis and assessment gives us a way of anchoring evaluation of return on investment and decisions on strategic investments, divestments, and re-engineered approaches to problems. So the Department of Homeland Security, the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, was created in 2003. Our current secretary is Janet Napolitano. She was appointed in 2009. We have a workforce of approximately 210,000 people. And we are comprised of a headquarters organization and 7 operational components: the Transportation Security Administration, the United States Secret Service, the U.S. Coast Guard, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, and 3 of our immigration and customs and border organizations: U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, U.S. Customs and Border Protection, and U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement. Now, each of these organizations has processes to evaluate and address risk and to use risk to inform decisions. Some of those major risk activities include the U.S. Coast Guard's National Maritime Strategic Risk Assessment and Maritime Security Risk Assessment Model, FEMA's Threat and Hazard Identification and Risk Assessment process, the National Risk Estimates and National Risk Profile developed by our Homeland Infrastructure Threat and Risk Analysis Center, the Transportation Security Administration's Transportation Security Sector Risk Assessment, various risk assessments performed by our Science and Technology Directorate, and a radiological and nuclear terrorism risk assessment conducted by our Domestic Nuclear Detection Office. Our challenge is to develop products and methods for using macro-level risk modeling, assessment, and analysis to help drive decisions at a cross-organizational and indeed at an intergovernmental level. So this office, the Office of Strategy, Planning, Analysis, and Risk, was formed within the DHS Office of Policy a little over a year ago as of World Risk Day 2013 by merging strategic planning and risk analysis offices within the Department of Homeland Security. And the purpose of doing that was to elevate the importance of a strong risk modeling, analysis, and strategic planning function within the department. And this is consistent with Secretary Napolitano's vision and the department's approach to integrating risk-based decision-making across the department. And we really have two parts to our mission. First, to develop analytically driven high-impact products to improve DHS and Homeland Security enterprise strategic direction, integration, and decision-making, but also to design and refine DHS processes necessary for the strategic management of the Quadrennial Homeland Security Review missions, as we talked about, and for DHS strategy, planning, and analysis to have the intended beneficial impact on Homeland Security activities. And what I wanted to talk about today, what I wanted to share in this session, were some of the lessons we've learned so far from this process, since we believe they're relevant in both the public and the private space. So, strategic planning, risk modeling, analysis, and assessment. There are two assessments that I wanted to speak about today and share some lessons learned, things that we've learned from the process of conducting and using these assessments. The first is the Strategic National Risk Assessment. Presidential Policy Directive 8, issued by President Obama approximately 2 years ago, ties national preparedness to the threats that pose the greatest risk to the security of the nation. And so that includes acts of terrorism, pandemics, and other naturally occurring disease outbreaks, and catastrophic national disasters. And the implementation plan that underpins this presidential directive mandates that the Secretary of Homeland Security conduct a strategic national level risk assessment. So this illustrates the first lesson that we've learned, which is a strong executive mandate is critical. In the first Quadrennial Homeland Security Review, the Department called for a Homeland Security National Risk Assessment, but various issues intervened. A presidential policy directive that explicitly linked risk assessment to preparedness targets creates a mandate both for the assessment and for its use. In the private sector, this would be equivalent to an executive mandate from firm leadership, from boards of directors, for using macro-level risk to inform decisions. So displayed on the slide now, in front of you, are the range of threats and hazards that were analyzed in the Strategic National Risk Assessment. And again, the presidential directive focused this assessment on threats that pose the greatest risk to the security of the nation. Again, these are contingency risks. And so this is meant to assess the relative risk posed by this variety of potential contingency incidents. Now, it's worth noting that in the private sector, these types of threats and hazards may be risks that would impact overall return on investment. For the Department of Homeland Security, and indeed for many governmental organizations in the defense and security space, the extent to which our activities and the activities of our partners, stakeholders, state and local and other levels of government, in the private sector, at non-governmental organizations, and our international partners manage these risks is our return on investment. And so our return on investment, our value proposition, our brand value is tied directly back to the assessment and mitigation of macro-level risk. More on this in a few minutes. So our methodology for conducting the Strategic National Risk Assessment should not look unfamiliar to anyone who has conducted macro-level risk assessments. We looked at risk as a factor of likelihood and consequence. And because of the various event types that were assessed as part of this Strategic National Risk Assessment, threat and vulnerability broke down in different ways depending on whether the act was caused by an individual or naturally occurring and for other factors. In addition to that basic approach to risk, we identified 6 consequence categories to assess these various threats and hazards: fatalities, injuries and illnesses, direct economic impacts, social impacts, psychological impacts, and environmental impacts. We were aiming for order of magnitude precision. We used a variety of data inputs and sources, and the time horizon was the next 3 to 5 years. One of the key lessons that I'd point out here is to arrive at commonality of terms. Each of these items on these bullets on the slide in front of you can be interpreted in different ways by different stakeholders and participants in your risk assessment process. And so it's absolutely critical to come to a common agreement as to the meaning of these terms and how they'll be assessed. I'd also point out the importance of arriving at the consequence categories. Because again, risk assessment isn't done for its own purpose. It's done to help drive strategic decision making. And so it's critically important to identify the impacts that matter most to the enterprise making the decision. What are the impacts that drive the decisions? An agreement on these and other terms is critical. And more on selection of these type of impact categories in a few minutes. So again, as laid out in the presidential directive, the Strategic National Risk Assessment was meant to inform the construction and evolution of the National Preparedness Goal, which is an all-hazards capability-based approach to preparedness planning. And so the point is, could we use risk to help us identify preparedness capabilities and ultimately preparedness targets, levels of preparedness that would make us as a nation better able to address disruptions of various types. And so this process of evaluating risk, identifying preparedness capabilities and preparedness targets is an interactive and iterative process. And risk will help to inform this in several ways as we go forward in developing and maturing the National Preparedness Goal. So now let me talk about a second example that we have used. This is the Homeland Security National Risk Characterization, and it's part of a larger activity that we've done in conjunction with our second Quadrennial Homeland Security Review to assess the Homeland Security strategic environment. So the Homeland Security Act of 2002, which has been amended several times since the creation of our department, requires our department to conduct this Quadrennial Homeland Security Review, which is a comprehensive examination of the Homeland Security strategy of the nation. And it's to include recommendations regarding long-term strategy and priorities and guidance on programs, assets, capabilities, budget policies, and authorities. Now, in order to do this effectively for Homeland Security, this requires a characterization of Homeland Security risks in order to set those long-term strategy and priorities and to assess those programs, assets, capabilities, budget policies, and authorities. Again, if ultimately Homeland Security is about effectively managing risks to the nation's security, then strategic planning in Homeland Security is inherently linked to risk assessment and analysis. And so therefore, it requires that integrated approach to strategic planning, risk modeling, analysis, and assessment. And so that's another key lesson that I'd point out here, is that for organizations in the defense and security space, integrating the strategic planning, risk modeling, and analysis functions provides significantly improved ability to risk-inform strategy and strategic choice. The consolidation of these functions enables leveraging of risk analytics to inform a wide range of Homeland Security decision-making. And the strategic planning process enables that facilitated discussion and decision about risk areas of concern that can lead to better alignment of resources to those risk areas. On the slide in front of you, you see the threats and hazards that were analyzed for this first Homeland Security National Risk Characterization. What you'll notice is that this is a broader range of threats and hazards than were evaluated for the Strategic National Risk Assessment, because we were not looking to find the threats that pose the greatest risk to the nation, but rather to characterize the entire Homeland Security risk space. In particular, what this characterization seeks to do is to look across both contingency and persistent responsibility, and to determine a way in which to characterize in a common fashion both persistent and contingency risks. So what does this require? It requires that event definitions be clear. Standardizing definitions facilitates appropriate comparisons across the risks for threats and hazards. And it's critically important to do this to normalize event thresholds for inclusion in the assessment. And so this is by events, and also within events. So when we talk about a flood, are we talking about a 1-year flood, a 5-year flood, a 10-year flood, a 100-year flood, a 1,000-year flood? And should we look at that as one incident? Should we look at that as a variety of categories within that particular hazard? So in addition to identifying these hazards, we then need to map them onto a continuum of frequencies. And so recognizing that we have both contingent and persistent risks, and that they fall along a range of possible likelihoods, we chose to use a continuum rather than to create a bright line distinguishing between persistent and contingent risks. Different types of events fall at different points along this continuum of frequency, running from continuous daily and weekly events to events occurring on an average of every year, every 10 years, every century, etc. And of course, the challenge is to convert likelihood assessments into a common frequency scale. Now, some associated challenges with this, some frequency elements are inherently linked to consequences, creating interdependencies. As noted on the slide before, it's important to identify the thresholds within the different events, as opposed to trying to characterize the events as a whole, since that allows frequency-consequence interdependencies to be more fully exposed. It's important to recognize there are vast differences in frequency judgments concerning low data events or intelligent adversary events. And so recognizing these levels of uncertainty is a crucial element in making these macro-level risk assessments useful for decision makers. And we'll talk about that in a few moments. And again, one warning that all working in this space know, the frequency judgments can leave open the possibility for black swans. And so it becomes important to figure out ways to display alternate results, and in particular to expose assumptions. But again, the main point is to figure out a way to display and characterize the full risk spectrum, the full decision space, so that decision makers using this characterization can be most well informed in making the types of decisions that they will be called on to make. Now, I spoke regarding an earlier slide about consequence or impact categories. For the Homeland Security National Risk Characterization, through the process used to develop that, we identified 9 categories of consequences relevant to the assessment. In this first iteration, we were not able to quantify and assess all of these categories, but as you can see, there's a range of different potential consequences and impacts that would have a bearing on how leadership makes decisions about these issues. And again, referring to something I noted at the beginning of the presentation, since all decisions in the public management space sit at the intersection of the operational and the technical and the political, understanding the different consequence categories and the impacts of importance to each of those constituencies is important for making the risk characterization useful as a tool to aid decision making. So one thing to stress here, and one thing that we are cognizant of, is that defining these consequence categories and their relative weightings, the weightings used to compare and assess one to the other, an essential element of risk assessment, both to define and to expose, because we know that different decision makers weigh the consequences of various events differently, as do different constituencies, different political parties, different societies. And so it's important to identify what those categories are that are driving judgments and to independently assess them. Moreover, it's important to carry out a deliberate process to determine the weight that decision makers place on consequence categories. And by weighting the consequence categories in that way, you can then approximate the value judgments of decision makers in subsequent analyses, assess the similar risks along the same scale, and also alter the weightings to show the results of alternate judgments. You can also adjust assessments to show preferences of new decision makers and compare judgments across constituencies or political constituencies or societies. Ultimately, what consequence categories and their weightings illustrate is the inseparable linkage, that inseparable linkage between technical questions and political questions in public policy and public administration. But exposing the categories and the assumptions that lead to the weightings can appropriately allocate technical questions to analysts and political questions to political leaders. In the same way, that by analogy, decisions can be made transparent to private executives, boards of directors, and stakeholders, and shareholders. And likewise, these categories and the assumptions also aid in risk communication, as we'll talk about in a moment. So this is one of the intermediate displays that we use in the characterization, and this should not be unfamiliar to many of you who conduct these types of assessments and generate these types of displays. But the point of this kind of chart, as I think most of the listeners will know, is about making sense of uncertainty. A lot of times, and I don't think this is unique to the public sector or unique to this organization, there's a desire for the type of certainty that would lead to a one-to-n ordering of risks or precision about specific levels of risks. But as we all know, uncertainty often precludes that kind of judgments. So risk characterization necessarily begins with identifying standout risks, by order of magnitude, and then can progress to tiering and grouping. And with greater understanding of consequence categories and relative weights, alternative views can identify different standout risks and expose different ways of looking at the risk space and different potential judgments about strategies. Ultimately, though, and again, the key thing to keep in mind in conducting and using the macro-level risk assessment and characterization is that we are trying to progress from analysis to decisions. And there's got to be linkage between risk modeling analysis and assessment with strategy, future research, and risk communication. So the goals of the National Homeland Security Risk Characterization are to harmonize and synthesize existing heterogeneous risk data and analysis, to derive and then apply a common assessment framework to quantitatively and or qualitatively assess, analyze, and understand the comprehensive scope of contingency and persistent risks, and to drive to that overall master understanding at a macro level of the most significant homeland security risks to the nation. And again, the point is not to conduct the perfect risk assessment. At the macro level, there is simply too much uncertainty in the strategic environment for that. The point is to understand enough to inform decisions, again, those decisions at the intersection of the operational, technical, and political, about strategic issues such as prioritization, areas of emphasis and de-emphasis, and return on the public's investment. And this is analogous to decisions about brand positioning and strategic investment and divestment, market entry or exit. Finally, one thing that we know is that risk characterizations and risk analyses, particularly at the macro level, it's not enough that they be that static snapshot in time, but they need to be a dynamic and reflect potential changes in the future, things that we can see through measurable trends, but also looking at future uncertainties and interdependencies and causal relationships, we can come to overall insights that can aid in decision-making. So by marrying up current risk characterization with trends and future uncertainties and systemic interdependencies, we can clarify that risk picture and help to avoid blind spots. We can place recent Homeland Security events in context, try to describe global dynamics and meta-trends that are shaping the strategic environment and that provide the opportunity to shape the environment through proactive strategies. Again, capture those interdependencies and system relationships, and identify key challenges and opportunities. And of course, in the government defense and security space, that's important for capital investments, which often have a long service life. But it's also important for other reasons. Risk priorities can provide the impetus for greater jointness of activities and integration of functions across organizations and levels of government. And they can also form the grounding for public communications to give rise to approaches that build greater resilience and better understanding of risk and risk acceptance. This is particularly important in a national Homeland Security setting because this is intrinsically a distributed system with many participants, many levels and layers of governance, and a variety of specific interests and priorities that need to interact in a coherent way. Finally, some last lessons that we've learned. These are lessons that I think would be familiar to anyone conducting these types of assessments. First, socialization, peer review, and verification and validation. Very important for the use of these types of assessments and characterizations in decision-making. And oftentimes, these steps can take 3 to 4 times as long as the actual data gathering and analysis. And so engaging stakeholders continuously through the process is as important, if not more important, than the specific results reached, and specifically the precision of the results reached. Second is the question of big data, and no data, and various types of restricted data. And any time that you work really in any type of risk assessment or characterization, and certainly in the government defense and security space, there will always be challenges in accessing data, in harmonizing heterogeneous data sets or previously structured data sets that were not structured in a way to make them commonly comparable, the standardization of definitions and thresholds that we discussed earlier, the challenge of structuring unstructured data in a useful way, and of mixing data from different assessments and analysis. And again, finally, risk communication. It's imperative, I think, on everyone in the risk community to focus on how we improve risk visualization to make it simpler to convey results and analysis to partners, to decision makers, and to the public. In particular, it's important to improve that internal risk communication with senior leadership by using common language to convey risk information and to find the ways to present risk information in the way that makes it easiest to make those follow-on strategic decisions. Because again, the risk analysis, assessment, characterization is not done for its own sake, but done to inform those strategic decisions. And of course, figuring out how to address questions of restrictions on data or origination controls in order to be able to disseminate and distribute results and to draw conclusions from risk assessment while also protecting information that needs to be protected. So these are some of the lessons that we've learned in conducting these activities and in working to use risk modeling, analysis, and assessments to inform Homeland Security policy and strategy. Thank you very much for the time today. And again, it was a privilege to be able to participate in World Risk Day. And that concludes my presentation.